An important skill in learning to teach is learning to plan. And planning for instruction is a very complex activity. It's an activity that actually becomes more and more inclusive of variables over time, meaning that what a beginner teacher thinks about when learning to plan or when planning lessons is quite different from all of the things that a more experienced teacher might think about. That's why, in part, when a beginner teacher looks at a lesson plan of a more experienced teacher, what he or she sees is far fewer words. The research on planning confirms that learning is directly correlated to teacher planning and preparation. Why do you think this might be so? Well, of course, there are many reasons, but one of the most important reasons is that when your plan is ready and you have an idea of the direction in which you are moving, you can then focus on its implementation. When, on the other hand, in your own mind, you are thinking about what will I do next? Where are the resources I need? Oh my goodness, how am I going to do that? It means that you're not focusing on the learner's questions, the learner's comments, how well the learner is engaged, because you're focusing on yourself as a teacher. To look at this focus on self, what we're talking about is a concept called cognitive capacity. Our capacity to think at any one time is finite. Let's say 100%. The total cognitive capacity is 100%, and in order to get something done, we use parts of that capacity. Our capacity to think or problem solve or complete a task at any one time is finite. When we multitask, we are dividing that 100% of capacity among many things. The more familiar one is with a task, the less cognitive capacity it requires. Put another way, when one is doing something for the first time, it will take more cognitive capacity. But when something is familiar but put into a new context with new constraints, that same task may also require more cognitive capacity. So, in order to complete the task, we must stop doing other things, like painting one's toenails. In order to reach a goal or complete a task, we rely on our cognitive capacity. And when giving a task, a teacher has to think about how much of that capacity is utilized. We call that amount the cognitive load. When the task requires less cognitive load than the cognitive capacity that's available, it can be completed reasonably smoothly. And that cognitive load involves effort, knowledge, attitudes, skills that are required to reach that task. However, when the cognitive load is greater than the capacity that's available, then a learner may begin to feel frustrated, confused, and overwhelmed. In that case, they either don't want to complete the task or perhaps are unable to do so. In this case, it is best to look at that original task and to divide it into chunks. Then one can approach the completion of the task in steps. When one learns chunk 1 and has enough cognitive capacity to be able to process and complete the task, one is ready for chunk 2. And chunk 1 becomes a foundational step for chunk 2. When one has completed chunk 1 and chunk 2, then there is a foundation for completing chunk 3, and there is still enough cognitive capacity for the processing of all 3 chunks. It has been said that teachers make over 200 decisions in a minute. What would those decisions be? How many are almost simultaneous? Well, teachers think about what to say, what to do, what words to use. Should they gesture something? Should they write something on the board? They think about what are the students doing? What do they anticipate students' answers to be? Whom would they select to answer a question? Someone who has their hand up or someone who hasn't spoken for a while? What would they do if the answer is correct? Should they praise? Should they redirect? How would they manage the entire class while they're teaching and trying to reach some of those goals? And those are just a few of the 200 things that teachers are thinking about. As a teacher learns to plan, you have to remember that there are many things to be thinking about. And a beginner teacher is learning to plan a little bit like a beginner skier is learning to ski. When one is a beginner skier, one starts at the top of the hill with instructions about how to hold one's hands, how to hold one's knees, what one's posture is like, and where the poles should go. And then one starts down the hill. In the process of going down the hill, one may forget some of those things, and one may even crash at the bottom of the hill. However, one goes back to the top of the hill and begins to think about all of those things again. With increased practice thinking about those things, their importance decreases in size, and that beginner teacher can begin to think about other things. Let's compare that to the more experienced teacher who's planning a lesson. Well, all of those things that were really important to a beginner teacher become less important to a more experienced teacher because it's almost like it's second nature. They do it almost automatically. However, the more experienced teacher still has things on his or her mind, but there's also the cognitive capacity available to think about those other things. Now, learning to plan is about learning steps, and as you become comfortable with that series of steps, we could say that you now have a move. What would be an example of a move? Well, perhaps when you begin to teach, you think about, oh, I have to remember to hand out these materials before I write something on the board, and then to explain things orally. But you'll begin to be able to do that very comfortably without thinking about those steps. That would be a move. With experience, a teacher will have many steps that become moves. And all of those moves, with time, will come together to become a routine. So whereas the beginner teacher is thinking about moving from steps to moves, a more experienced teacher is thinking about moving the moves together in establishing a routine. The